The first time I set foot on the Provincetown dunes, under a crisp, clear October sky, was like stepping onto another planet, walking up a wall of sugar.
"18 shacks are scattered in the dunes along a 5-mile stretch of the Cape Cod National Seashore, remnants of an age when their shelter meant warmth and civilization to shipwrecked sailors. During the past century, the dune shacks have lured a different kind of traveler, in search not of civilization, but of solitude.
To have this wonderful opportunity to exist in a natural environment, and to say nothing of its beauty, but in a natural environment where you can know yourself as a human being without television, without electricity, without plumbing, without the need to give up your own soul and philosophy to commerce in the way we're pressed into machines.
Many 20th century artists have visited the shacks to write, take photographs, or paint. Eugene O'Neill, Jack Kerouac, Annie Dillard, Walker Evans, E.E. Cummings, Jackson Pollock, Edmund Wilson, Cynthia Huntington, and Norman Mailer. Hundreds of other less well-known dune lovers have found inspiration from shack time. But the preservation and future use of the shacks is very much in doubt. The creation of the Cape Cod National Seashore in 1961 staved off the greatest threat to the fragile dune environment, the encroachment of commerce and developers. The question of how to preserve this small and unique cultural asset, the shacks, within a larger natural one, the park, remains a matter of intense debate.
It's like trying to hold a butterfly. When you touch it, you've damaged it.
The dunes themselves are the unintended product of an early interaction between humans and nature.
When the Mayflower dropped anchor in Provincetown Harbor, and her weary passengers at last had a chance to stand on a steady deck and look about them, they saw a shore wooded to the water's edge as far as the eye could reach.
The European settlers' appetite for wood to make shipmasts and to build and heat their homes exposed the sandy soil and made the landscape forever vulnerable to shifting winds. The first dune shacks were built in the late 1700s, though not to experience solitude.
The Massachusetts Humane Society began by building huts on remote beaches to shelter survivors who might get ashore unaided. This was a much-needed measure, for a shipwrecked man's trouble had only just begun when he dragged himself about the reach of the surf.
When I thought what must be the condition of the families which alone would ever occupy or had occupied them, what must have been the tragedy of the winter evenings spent by human beings around their hearths, these houses, though they were meant for human dwellings, did not look cheerful to me. They appeared but a stage to the grave.
The Coast Guard played a role in the building of newer shacks in the early 1900s, but for different reasons.
The story goes that some of the people who manned the stations got lonely for their wives or girlfriends and built little shacks out in the dunes to have some company. And the girls' friends and wives took one look at these little shacks out in the middle of nowhere and said, "You've got to be kidding."
These newer shacks and others built by determined dune lovers gradually passed into private hands in the 1920s and 30s and have since become treasured retreats, fragile anchors amid immense sand and space, a place people go to be alone with nature and the elements. Most of the shacks are small, primitive buildings that can be pushed back upright when blown over by a storm and provide little other than cover from the rain. Even the old life-saving station, owned in later years by Eugene O'Neill, fell into the sea following a great storm in the 1930s.
Residence on the dunes at Peaked Hill Bars is uniquely sheltering and certainly stimulating to creative work. It's true that I was working on the Road there, summer of 1950, and also on poems and articles.
The shacks have attracted many eccentric personalities through the years, less well known but fondly remembered by their fellow dune dwellers. People like Harry Kemp, the so-called poet of the dunes, Hazel Hawthorne Werner, the painters Jan Gelb and Boris Margot, Peg Watson and Leo Florant, who actually died in their shacks, and Al Fearing, shown here with his wife and children, who typically wore only a top hat in the dunes.
He would come down to visit Stan with a drink in one hand, a tall silk hat, and he just flopped along. But now what do you want me to say about the flopping?
Once a year, on the August moon, they would have a bonfire and a party. They'd been collecting driftwood all summer long, and Boris put together a kind of sculpture out of all the driftwood, which he spent probably a couple of months putting together. During the, I think they called it the howling, they would light off the bonfire, and all of their artist friends from town would come out. And anyone else who felt like it at the time.
When Harry Kemp came, arrived at my shack, which was a most unusual occurrence, and I got to know why he was there. That meant he'd been out on the town. We would sit down in the morning and talk, and I would have my cocoa, and he'd have make cocoa for him, and a couple of hours would pass, and I'd be making oatmeal for him, and then a couple of hours would pass, and but what was finally I ran out of food altogether. By nighttime, I ran out of all food. The oatmeal was gone, the carrots were gone, the cocoa was gone, and we were still talking.
Shack owner Hazel Hawthorne Werner, shown here in a portrait by Walker Evans, was a central figure in the dunes.
She owned at that time 2 dune shacks and was willing to have her friends and acquaintances use the shacks. So a lot of people got their first introduction to the dunes through Hazel. She, in many ways, epitomized the current bohemian notion of what the shacks were all about. One of her daughters took up with Jack Kerouac, and he spent some time out there. She allowed Norman Mailer to spend some time there. There are a fair number of literary and artistic names that went there because Hazel was there.
What do I do in the dunes? I walk, read, write, nap, and most of all, do nothing. I am forced to be alone with my thoughts, acutely aware of the planet and the rhythms of the natural world, without the usual filters and distractions of civilization. Time spent in the dunes is like running into a wall of water. You have no choice but to slow down. There's no telephone, mail, newspapers, or interruptions. Just you and the Atlantic Ocean. Staying in the shacks is a cut above camping. I use an outhouse, pump my own water. There's a gas refrigerator and hot plate, though, and at one or two shacks, a solar-heated shower.
You have lots of gnats and flies. You have spiders and snakes. You have crummy weather. You have the mosquitoes coming through the cracks in the boards.
A tremendous awareness of how a day goes, how the sun changes, how the winds change, things that you're never aware of in the city. The direction of a wind is completely different weather. If it's northeast, it's different from the south winds. It's the flies come sometimes with the land winds. The northeast, the waves are very high. The beach changes. Every kind of element has an impact on you, and in the city, you're numb to all that.
The daily rituals of cooking and cleaning, pumping water or sweeping sand take on great significance. Each activity is undertaken singly in its own moment, receiving one's complete attention. You might take half a day to prepare a meal and the other half to eat it.
That particular community happens in this particular place because of not just the dunes, but because of Provincetown.
I experience community in the dunes as well as solitude, of fellow dune dwellers, past and present.
It's not just that the shack takes on its own presence and personality and things, but the sort of voices of those other people and the presence of those other people, whether there's anything visually left or not, I always feel is here.
This room became the camera, and she had, covered the windows up and had little pinholes, and actually took photographs of what you see out of each window, So in a way, it kind of really made use of the shack in a way that maybe it hadn't been used. I don't think it's been used that way before, but just the fact that we have this interaction through the skin of the shack.
I start off by pacing back and forth across 6 feet of floor space, opening all the windows, chewing on my pen, and staring out as the world goes on beyond me. The shack is a retreat in the center of endless space, offering just the finest separation between inside and outside, its open windows and the cracks between its boards delicately entangling me in a continuum of light and sound.
At first, the landscape appears spare, even stark, comprising broad bands of blue, green, white, and beige, sky, ocean, beach, dune grass. But the longer I stay, 1,000 variations become visible within each band, changed and charged by the endlessly varying light.
Creativity needs solitude and a lack of distractions, and I think that's what one gets here. I do the painting really for my own enjoyment. I'm certainly not proficient, but the experience of sitting and looking in the kind of quiet that's here, and the having to be with oneself without anything else, that you have to go into yourself rather than being focused outward. And I think that's the heart of creativity.
This was time to work for me.
Time to work?
To work on drawing. I mean, I put in about 90 hours on a single drawing, which was more time than I've had in quite some time for that.
That's kind of the reverse of me, because when I come out here, I'm like, I have these great plans I'm going to be really disciplined, and I'm going to work on my drawing, and I'm going to take pictures, and I'm going to write stuff down, and I never do. But then, I don't even sketch a feather, nothing. But then 3 or 4 weeks after I was here, then I start drawing things that were here.
But here on Earth, texture interests us supremely. Wherever there is life, there is twist and mess. The frizz of an Arctic lichen, the tangle of brush along a bank, the dog leg of a dog's leg, the way a line has got to curve, split, or knob. The planet is characterized by its very jaggedness, its random heaps of dunes, its frayed fringes of shore. The texture of the world, its filigree and scroll work, means that there is the possibility for beauty here, a beauty inexhaustible in its complexity, which opens to my knock, which answers in me a call I do not remember calling, and which trains me to the wild and extravagant nature of the spirit I seek.
I ask the wind why it blows, ask the grass why it grows, ask the sky why heavens cry, and ask a stone for all it knows.
In recent years, the Shadow Writing Project has introduced a new generation of aspiring artists to the dunes, like Guy Yingling.
I'm sheltered from the wind by a dune, sheltered from the dark by the moon.
Night is very beautiful on this great beach. It's the true other half of the day's tremendous wheel. No lights without meaning stab or trouble it. It is beauty, it is fulfillment, it is rest. Thin clouds float in these heavens, islands of obscurity in the splendor of space and stars. The Milky Way bridges earth and ocean. The beach resolves itself into unity of form. Its summer lagoons, its slopes and uplands merging. Against the western sky and the falling bow of the sun rise the silent and superb undulations of the dunes.
Norman Mailer, who worked in a shack in the dunes in 1961, said, "The way of the artist is curious and can never be determined. But it is a fact that many need solitude, and some of the greatest works done in America, notably the early plays of Eugene O'Neill, have come from living in solitude in the dunes and shacks on the back shore of Cape Cod."
I am of the opinion that the Peaked Hill cottages are not at all inharmonious with the park landscape, but actual museum-like adjuncts to the real meaning of the park.
Within the next few years, all but one of the 18 shacks will belong to the Cape Cod National Seashore, a part of the National Park Service. The Peaked Hill Trust, a nonprofit organization that has managed several of the dune shacks since the mid-1980s, was part of a successful effort to make the shacks eligible for the National Historic Register. The designation leaves many unanswered questions.
The Register of Historic Places, in its listing qualifications for the shacks, discusses the use of the shacks more than their physical structures. That is to say that the places have a value because of the way they're used, because of what they offer people.
The Park Service has been discussing who will have the opportunity to experience the dune shacks.
Well, if you look just strictly at the determination of eligibility, it talks about the longstanding association of the shacks with the arts community. It talks about the unusual Spartan character of the shacks and their isolated presence and position out there in the dunes, their sort of relationship to the landscape. And those elements are absolutely central to the significance of the shacks, but they don't entirely capture, at least in my personal opinion, what has made those shacks so special. Because there's a mystique about the shacks that has to do with the lives that have been associated with them. And it's not just famous artists' lives. If you talk to those 15 people that I mentioned earlier, you'll find them talking about the parties that went on out there, the incredible spiritual sense of isolation and remoteness, and the personal connection that they had with the natural environment. You'll hear them talk about the kinds of family and friendship kinds of relationships that were nurtured over the years because of joint associations with those shacks. You'll hear them talk about all kinds of things that have to do with people's feelings about the shacks and their relationship to those shacks that are not entirely captured by just the Spartan location, unusual construction materials, and association with the arts.
The Park Service has experimented with several types of leases.
In one case, the public goes out a couple of times a week, a very limited number of people, through a reservation process, and actually talk with the artist on site, ask the person questions, and explore what it's like to be out there and so forth. That to us was, it's a little contrived, but in fact, many folks who stayed out there had guests come out on a regular basis, threw parties out there, had members of the public might just happen upon them if they were out for a stroll on the beach. So, although it's a bit artificial, it kind of maintains the opportunity for people, just the general public, to talk with the artists and have a chance to see what they're doing.
50 years ago, you could buy one for $50 or whatever. And there wasn't much in the way of restriction in terms of who could even build one and live in it. Gets knocked over, you build again. And then, in the last 35 years, you have this situation where they have become precious resources, limited, finite, time sensitive. And how do you keep from being institutional in that sense?
I feel fortunate to have spent time in the dune shacks, and I am glad to see them become part of the public trust. But I worry that their tradition, particularly the solitude they provide, will prove harder to preserve than their physical structures. The shacks remain as enduring and as fragile as the land on which they stand.
The Cape itself as a geological feature will be here only very briefly. It's basically an Ice Age geological deposit that's been under steady attack by coastal erosion and will eventually, within only several thousand more years, probably erode away altogether. So I think that the relationships of the Cape to the Earth more or less parallels the relationship of the shacks to their landscape.